May I have your attention? May I have your attention? That is the mic. Oh, what? No. Is the mic on?
In your mouth.
No. Okay. Boy. All right, we're going to start. Welcome back and thank you. Okay. This morning, we heard about the life of Sarah Breedlove, an earlier voyager on the, you can't hear. Good grief. I'm supposed to be good at this. All right. All right. This morning, we heard the story of Sarah Breedlove, one of the earliest voyagers on the second Middle Passage. This afternoon, we are going to hear the life of John Lewis, one of the late passengers on that hellish voyage. But he wasn't only a passenger, he was one of those who brought the U.S. America ship to ground. Reviewers have described David Greenberg's biography, John Lewis, A Life, as panoramic and richly insightful, a biography that captures Lewis's life, life, achievements, and at times heart-stopping precision. I would like to add it's a life story written with a sensitivity that shows John Lewis's morality, something we miss today in our nation's capital. And he does that while acknowledging the subject's misjudgment as he showcases Lewis's gritty achievements. As I told David, I found his book to be a master class in biographical writing. Please welcome David Greenberg.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Ray, and thank you, Steve, and everyone who has assembled this wonderful conference today. I've already learned so much and just so enjoyed the panels and Alilia's talk. And I'm very happy to see people already accumulating these big piles of books to take home with you. You know, I was going to say save room for dessert, but also save room for one more book because we've got a few John Lewis A Life still there. And you know, I often come and talk about John Lewis's life, and I could easily fill the hour with just the narration and stories of his rich and consequential life, and I am obviously going to do some of that today, but I wanted to say a word too about the writing of biography, because that's why we're here, and so some of the things that went into my decision to write the book and how I went about it. You know, the first question I'm often asked, because I don't normally lead with this, will be, well, why did you want to write a book about John Lewis? You know, what led you to this subject? It didn't seem such a stretch to me. I mean, I am a historian of American politics, and most of my books had been on the presidency in some fashion. I'd written a book on Richard Nixon. I'd written a history of the White House spin machines, or the development of the whole apparatus of communications and image making and messaging. And it seemed to me John Lewis is very much a critical political figure of our times. But it was also true that I had not, in my career, written a story, a history in which the American struggle against racism, to overcome racism, was at the heart of the story. And I think most American historians, whether you're a specialist in Black history or not, would agree that that is a central, perhaps the central thread in the American story. And so it seemed to me that that was an important subject that I, as a historian, should take on in some way. But the subject itself came about almost by happenstance. We were in the middle of the first Trump term, and people sometimes say this book is timely, and in a way, I had intended it almost as the opposite of timely. This was 2018, 2019. I was starting to get this idea, and after this book I had done on spin, people were saying, well, now you've got to write the next book on Trump. Even had a title which was Beyond Spin, to sort of where had the manipulation of truth gone in those years. But the truth was, I didn't want to wake up each day confronted any more than I already was with Donald Trump. You turn on the TV, the radio, open up the computer, and there was Trump. And I was looking for a subject as a historian to take me away from the unpleasant present. And it occurs to me one day, I'm watching a documentary about Robert F. Kennedy, the original Robert F. Kennedy, and his 1968 race for president, and there comes on the screen John Lewis as a talking head. Now, John Lewis, at that point in his young life, 28, had recently left SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and was kind of casting about for a future. And Robert Kennedy decides to run for president, and Lewis sends him a telegram, says he wants to join the campaign and becomes, a key figure, being a liaison to the black community, and is with him in Indianapolis the night that Martin Luther King is murdered. He's also there in Los Angeles at the Ambassador Hotel the night that Kennedy himself is killed. And so it's an important chapter in his life, a very traumatic and deeply depressing time in his life as well. But I see John Lewis, in this documentary, I say, oh, that's interesting. This is a moment where John Lewis is popping up more and more in the news. 2018, toward the end of his life, he was kind of transforming from a highly respected, admired historical figure and congressman into this kind of living legend, icon that, at the time of his death, with the kind of recognition that he got then, we all saw him to be. So I thought, this is an interesting thing. And I went online, looked around, no one had written a biography of John Lewis. It was a bit of a surprise. So I sort of thought this was an opportunity that I should avail myself of. The hard part was getting John Lewis's time and his ear and his permission. Very busy man. I was going to say guarded, and maybe that's too strong, but I think not too strong. He had a very loyal group of staff around him who I think were understandably concerned, very much in the business of protecting his image. And so it wasn't necessarily they were going to let anyone in the door to interview him. But over time, I wore them down. I got a meeting with John Lewis in February of 2019. It was sort of peak John Lewis. The week before, he had just done the coin toss at the Super Bowl in Atlanta. And then the next day, he was going to Los Angeles to introduce Green Book at the Oscars. So you have the Super Bowl and the Oscars, featuring John Lewis. And here I am wedged in on a Friday afternoon in his Atlanta office. You go into his office and, posters and campaign memorabilia and historic photographs all over the wall. Every inch of shelf space and mantelpiece is lined with different trophies and awards and other recognition that he's gotten. And I'm really just there to sort of get his agreement, his blessing to write this book, which, no sooner had I asked the question than he agreed. And I have to think, well, what do I do with the rest of this interview? Because I really hadn't started the deep research, the kinds of detailed questions that I would want that would lead him to give me something other than the kinds of stories he had told a million times before. So it was an okay interview, and then later in the year, it was later that year that tragically he learned he had pancreatic cancer, so he didn't have much longer to live after that. We did have a couple of phone interviews during the pandemic, because the pandemic then hit soon in early 2020. And those phone interviews, again, I found a few things I could use, but really what I had to turn to were other sources. And in a way, somebody mentioned this on one of the panels this morning, one of the challenges, but also one of the joys and the pleasures, and I think what makes a biography especially rewarding is when there aren't previous biographies of the person, is you sort of have to cut your own path. You know, you kind of feel like you're hiking through territory that where the path hasn't been cut, and you sort of have to decide, you know, which way to go, and, you know, in a given year, what are the important stories to tell? There's no template. There's no kind of existing body that you have to reckon with. Now, for the civil rights years, of course, to some degree there was. But I found through a kind of combination of the archival material, some of which had been looked at, but generally not through the lens of what does it say about John Lewis. So that could be very useful. The SNCC papers, for example, people have written wonderful books on SNCC, Clay Carson and others, but they didn't go through and see in the SNCC papers letters from John Lewis's mother that were there under, you know, chairman's files. So there was a lot there to be found. Then, of course, sort of a very voluminous periodical record, including, again, as somebody mentioned this morning, black newspapers, which are often telling stories, getting into details, covering certain events that aren't going to be covered in white newspapers. And then, sort of above all, less so for the civil rights years, for the earlier period, than for the recent period, the interviews. At first, I was disappointed when John Lewis's chief of staff, Michael Collins, who was very generous with his time, with opening doors for me, but he told me, as far as the congressional papers would go, they weren't even processed yet. They were in boxes, they were in closets, in John Lewis's two houses, and, you know, maybe some of them had been given away to National Archives. No one really knew. It was a bit of a mess. So I didn't have the paper record for, you know, the last 34 years of his life. But people are still alive. And of course, there are many people from the earlier period still alive, and some of whom I talked to before their death, Robert Moses and others from SNCC. And then there are those still with us. Andrew Young, you know, gave me a wonderful interview from his office in Atlanta. But when I was talking about the congressional years and Congress, you know, talking to his staff, talking to his friends, other members of Congress, really could put together stories, some of which I realized were never going to be in the paper either. So, you know, historians were always told, trust the paper source. And, you know, that's generally true. If I have somebody's recollection of something that happened in 1963 at the March on Washington, but then I find the documentary record that suggests something different, I'm going to trust the paper. But there's all kinds of things about, you know, personal qualities of John Lewis's, you know, his love of dancing, despite being not so good at it, but getting out there and giving it his all. You know, his fondness for antiquing, just certain things that made it, I was able to bring into the book to give a full sense of the man. You know, I never would have gotten just from paper alone. So I've always enjoyed working on the boundary of sort of history and journalism, and I had been a journalist before becoming a historian. John Lewis said in one interview I found that he always liked what he called contemporary history, and that's sort of, I think, a good term for this. And it's a beauty of contemporary history that you can avail yourself of these different sources, the historian's tools of archives, and then also the journalist's tool of interview after interview after interview. And best of all is sort of when they interact. I began noticing a name in John Lewis's, you know, comings and goings, but a name that's not in his memoir at all, a man named Archie Allen. And Archie Allen was a white man from Virginia who went to Scarrett College in Nashville, Tennessee, a couple years younger than John Lewis. So he meets John Lewis in those Nashville years in the early 1960s, stays a close friend. In around 1968, decides he's going to write a biography of John Lewis. And this is, remarkably early. Again, no biography of Mr. Lewis had been written at the time I started this book. And I'm finding all these interviews that Archie Allen did with John Lewis's parents, some of his siblings, people from the movement long since dead, Ella Baker, Septima Clark, and I'm talking specifically about John Lewis. So these people, of course, had given other interviews, but not about John. So it's this wonderful trove of material, and I finally tracked down Archie Allen, who's now a chiropractor in Ojai, California. And I found him through Facebook, actually, which is a good tool for connecting people. Its networking affordances are quite good for historians and journalists. And Archie, at first, doesn't seem to want to talk that much because he says, well, I'm still planning to write my book. Now, Archie's in his 80s and has never written a book. And so I kind of think, all right, well, let me just keep trying. So we're doing phone call after phone call, and he's sharing lots of stories with me, giving me leads, telling me about people. And I keep saying, well, maybe I can come out there and visit you. And, because he tells me he's got a whole house full of more material. I had found some of it in the Nashville Public Library, both the interviews he had done, but also 10 or so amazing oral histories he had done with John Lewis from a period of about 1968 to 1979, covering sort of the whole of those years, sometimes in minute, almost week by week detail. So, no one had this, but there was more at the house. So I wanted to get the rest. And again, he still says, at one point he says, maybe we could write this book together. Well, I'll give you credit in the acknowledgments, credit in the footnotes. I'll thank you profusely at public events like this one. And then one day I get a call and he says, I'm at the post office. I have 3 banker's boxes full of material. Can I have your credit card number? Because it was like $298 to ship it. So I got out my credit card. Research expense, tax deductible. And, a week later comes these boxes with just amazing stuff. John Lewis's high school transcripts, his acceptance letter to college at American Baptist Theological Seminary. I don't know about all of you, but when I got accepted to college, nobody said, we hope it is in God's plan that you come and study with us. So maybe it was, judging from the course that history took. And all kinds of wonderful things. I mean, one letter that I've quoted in the book that he wrote in 1964 to his good friend Don Harris, later the best man at his wedding. They had, during kind of a very difficult, turbulent time in SNCC, after sort of the failure of the challenge at the Atlantic City Convention of 1964, where I'll hope you know the history and give you the short version. SNCC and the Mississippi Freedom Democrats were quite demoralized at not getting seated at that convention. And John and Don Harris take a trip to Africa for many, many weeks and just have this adventure, the two of them, where they kind of coincidentally run into Malcolm X in Nairobi, and all kinds of exciting things happen. They're there for Independence Day in Zambia and sort of describe in a memo just what that's like. So anyway, so in Archie's papers, there's this incredibly heartfelt letter from John to Don Harris, and John Lewis, was a very caring, feeling, emotional person, but he was also in some ways very guarded about his inner self. And that kind of deepest layer of feelings could be hard to kind of penetrate or get to. But in a few of these letters, like this one to Don Harris, you start seeing some of this. So anyway, it's just a treasure trove. And the reason I think that R.G. Allen, the reason I talk about these papers is because it's really kind of, I felt, came about through the using these tools together, right? The tools of the historian, the journals, the archives together with people, with having used social media, that these aren't separate sets of tools. They're sets of tools we can kind of combine and integrate. And when we do that, they can be even sort of more productive and revealing than if we were just kind of going down each path one at a time. So, as I talk now about John Lewis's life, which again, I'll try to do fairly concisely, although I often get caught up in the stories, and there's a certain exuberance in talking about it, because honestly, it did sustain me through those Trump years. That, we all know as writers, there are days where you just don't want to fire up the computer and you are not, but really with this project, most days I was really excited and eager to get down to work and to spend the day in John Lewis's company. And so it was a sustaining project for me. And, calling, I sort of felt a little bit guilty because a lot of this initial round of interviewing was done on the phone during the pandemic. So I felt guilty. I would tell people, yeah, I had a good pandemic, because you call up Andy Young and he'd be home. You call people up and they'd be there. I'll talk for an hour. So in that sense, it was very good. But anyway, I will try to sort of give a brief account of his life, maybe just trace a little bit of the themes that I see in his life. And I do want to sort of save time for questions, because I find that John Lewis is someone whose life touched a lot of people's lives. So whether you knew him as your congressman or a colleague, or a public figure you admired, or a historical subject, everybody has different kinds of questions they want to ask. One subtitle I almost had used for the book, but my editor and I agreed, kind of a little too academic sounding, was From Protest to Politics. That's the title of a Bayard Rustin essay, a famous essay, in which Rustin, who I found in the book was actually much more of a mentor to John Lewis than I think people had recognized previously. And Rustin is writing around the time that this split is developing in the movement, in SNCC, between a camp maybe represented by Rustin and King and John Lewis himself, that wants to stick to these goals of integration and interracial coalitions, as well as nonviolence, which of course was deeply important to Lewis, as it was to King and others, and the emerging Black Power movement, as Stokely Carmichael came to label it, and somewhat pushing back, although it's not directly framed as a riposte to Carmichael, who I don't think had been out there using Black Power yet. But From Protest to Politics says, this was a moment with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the imminent passage of the Voting Rights Act of '65, where people were asking, where does the civil rights movement go from here? It's in all the newspaper, all the discussions, and people were asking it internally, publicly. And Rustin's argument is, let's get into politics. In a way, he was saying, I want Black Power too, but he believed, attained through the coalition, as he put it, that brought us the March on Washington, that helped pass the civil rights and voting rights laws. And that's the path that John Lewis ends up following, particularly from Atlanta, from a mixed race district. He believes in not just an interracial coalition that becomes his base, but also a politics, a certain kind of liberal universalism that I think has kind of roots both in political liberalism, but just as or more important, in his Christian beliefs, in the humanity of each individual soul, and that he wants to sort of hold to that vision even as we are moving toward more kind of explicit race-conscious remedies and approaches to social and political problems. So like others who go, I mean, there are many people from the movement who go into politics. Julian Bond, who is John Lewis's best friend from the time he becomes chairman of SNCC and moves to Atlanta in '63 until perhaps they ran against each other in a very kind of bitter and tragic race for Congress in 1986 that I detail in the book in a standalone chapter that I almost thought could be a short book unto itself. But Julian Bond goes into politics, famously challenging the Georgia, first it's the legislature, and then he gets his seat in the Georgia State Senate. Another figure from the Nashville scene, Marion Barry, a less honorable political career perhaps in the end. But many others sort of follow this route from protest to politics. So the book is really framed in that way, where I have book one, which is sort of the years. I mean, I go back to his birth, of course, but essentially from when he arrives at American Baptist in Nashville in 1958 through the next decade. And then the years of politics, which really are much larger, many more years in terms of the composition of his life, but which in some ways I think people tended to not necessarily credit as equally important to his life. And when I was talking to editors, first shopping the book proposal around, there was sort of a sense, well, the civil rights years will dominate the book, and then we can sort of move pretty rapidly through the later years. And one reason the book grew to the length it did, although my editor kept telling me it doesn't read long, so keep that in mind as you approach the cash register. Yeah, it's a page turner, someone said, so here. We'll put that on the back blurb with Andy Young and Charlene Hunter Galt and others. But I found so much to learn about those political years. And again, because that was the story that really hadn't been told, that hadn't been mapped out by Taylor Branch and Dave Garrow and others in their magisterial histories. So you really could say, oh, here's a piece of the story that no one's looked at. And, sometimes it was just little tidbits. I mean, I don't think anyone had looked in the papers. Again, I couldn't get the John Lewis papers, but I discovered that in Atlanta at the Woodruff Library, there's a small collection, the Lillian Lewis papers. That's his wife. And lo and behold, in there was this amazing letter from James Baldwin from around 1975 or 6. And I was, it didn't really fit. It wasn't apropos of anything, but I just couldn't resist finding a place to kind of close out a chapter with it. And so to my delight, a recent short review of the book in my college alumni magazine closed with that quote from Baldwin. It's like, somebody else found the same delight in that quotation that I had seen. So, again, let me just do a quick kind of quick pass at John Lewis's life and sort of where we are now, and I'll try to leave some time for questions. It occurred to me, really, as I was first writing the proposal, that apart from Martin Luther King, there was probably nobody more central to the events of the years 1960 to 65 than John Lewis. And again, this is sort of surprising because, there was no biography of him. I think for many years he was known and admired as, important foot soldier in the movement. Obviously, Selma was remembered, but he didn't have that kind of iconic stature that he had really achieved at the end. But if you think about it, in 1960, he's a leader in the Nashville sit-in movement. And although Greensboro we remember as sort of the first sit-in, and of course it wasn't really even the first sit-in because there was a tradition of sit-ins before then, but it kicks off this wave of lunch counter sit-ins of the winter and spring of 1960. But it's the Nashville group that's the largest, the most robust, that gets results the fastest, and that produces a lot of the leadership of the movement for the coming years. And Nashville, it gets celebrated with a documentary on NBC. There's a Smithsonian Folkways album that they put out, the Nashville students and their mentor, James Lawson, freedom songs and also kind of spoken word accounts of what they've been through. And it's also, interestingly, the most integrated, because Fisk has had an exchange program. It's actually not really an exchange program, but it's often called that, where white students from California or Indiana would come to Fisk for a year or a semester to study. And you have to imagine that the kind of white person drawn to study at Fisk in the 1960s is also going to be drawn to the movement. And because a lot of those people got very involved with James Lawson and Kelly Miller Smith and the leaders of the Nashville group, the whole group kind of evolved with a very interracial ethos. And it was actually the Nashville group that popularized the song "We Shall Overcome" with its line "black and white together." And SNCC's logo was a black hand and a white hand holding hands in friendship and comradeship. So that Nashville movement was highly important. It was also the one that was most deeply devoted to nonviolence. Nonviolence, as John Lewis liked to say, not just as a tactic, but as a philosophy and a way of life. And that was certainly how the Reverend James Lawson saw it, and it's how John Lewis came to see it, even at the point where a lot of his friends felt, who had believed in it as a tactic, it had been very effective for a number of years, but it was time to sort of move on to different approaches. He never relinquished his commitment to it. After 1960, the lunch counters, Lewis is really the key figure, I would argue, in the freedom rides for desegregating interstate bus travel around the South. Because not only is he one of the original freedom riders who begin the trip in Washington and then go south to Alabama and beyond, but when the freedom rides are disrupted by white terrorist thugs in Anniston and Birmingham, and pretty much James Farmer of CORE decides he needs to end them, it's John Lewis and the Nashville group who decide, no, the show must go on. They build together a whole new group of freedom riders to pick up the bus trips and continue on. And John Lewis, again, is the link. He's the one who is on both legs, both set halves of this freedom ride journey. John Lewis is there at the March on Washington, the youngest speaker, age 23, as the newly appointed chairman of SNCC. A huge controversy around his speech arises because he's the one who refuses to give a speech purely endorsing the civil rights bill that President Kennedy has finally introduced, and insists on enumerating many criticisms that he and others at SNCC and SNCC have. Whole story I could tell about that, but 64, Mississippi Freedom Summer, John Lewis is there, a central player in that story, but he's also in 64 out in San Francisco protesting Barry Goldwater's nomination. This really, was not told in the John Lewis story previously. I had found a speech in James Forman's papers. Didn't know where the speech was, when it was given, but I found one sentence from it in a New York Times next day story about a protest at the 64 Republican Convention. So I could then figure out when exactly it was Lewis had given this speech. So 64, he's very much leader of SNCC, and of course, 65, Selma, a vitally important story to John Lewis's biography and, of course, to American history. Many scholars believe the Civil Rights Act, as important as it is and is second to the Voting Rights Act in the effect that it has had on the change in American politics. So for all of those years, there's this kind of centrality of John Lewis to the civil rights movement story that I think hasn't fully been appreciated. But again, what's kind of amazing is that he has this whole second act. F. Scott Fitzgerald says there are no second acts in American life, and with John Lewis, he is proven wrong. I'm sure there are others who prove that adage wrong too. And John Lewis's political career, I think, one can say, if not quite the equal of his protest career, is certainly one that too would warrant a historical accounting. After the failed presidential campaign, ending in Kennedy's assassination, he ends up going next to a place called the Voter Education Project, which sadly no longer exists today. But he was basically Stacey Abrams before Stacey Abrams. I mean, Stacey Abrams 2 years, 3 years before Stacey Abrams was born. And the project was to go around the South and get African Americans now, free, thanks to the Voting Rights Act, to exploit their constitutional right to vote, to take advantage of it, voter registration, and voting itself, and also to promote the election of black elected representatives. He does this for 7 years and really, makes dramatic gains, to the point where when Jimmy Carter is elected in 1976, it's sort of an interesting electoral map. It is not the map with which we're used to seeing Democrats in the last 20, 30 years win the presidency. He wins most of the South, and he wins most of the South based on black votes as well as some white liberal and moderate votes as well. And Carter actually loses a good bit of the North to Gerald Ford. And John Lewis goes saying in 76, the slogan of the Voter Education Project had been, "The hands that pick cotton now pick our public officials." And now he says, the hands that once picked cotton now have picked a president. And so he's quite proud of that accomplishment. He goes into the Carter administration. That is not such a happy turn for him. He feels that Carter is not attentive to the things that he had sort of promised or hoped for. But he returns to Atlanta. Next is city council politics. It's kind of good training for him. And then he's elected to Congress in 1986. And again, I won't review the whole campaign here, but it's a great standalone chapter of its own in the book, The Race Against Julian Bond. And then the years in Congress. And, just to say a word or two about them, we've been talking today about the importance of telling the stories and telling the stories to future generations. And I think if you can sort of find a theme in John Lewis's congressional accomplishments and how he devoted his energies in those years, some people would say, oh, he wasn't that much of a legislator. He didn't have there was voting rights, of course, which someone reminded me to bring up. So I have to credit that as an issue, a policy issue that he stayed with. But for the most part, he wasn't a policy guy doing housing policy or drug policy or urban policy. It was about preserving and protecting, and that's where voting rights come in, and promoting the memory and legacy of the movement of which he'd been a part. And so if you think about what was he doing in these years, one of the things he fought for 20 years to pass and finally did was the bill to create the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Mall. And he felt that was so important because it was necessary to tell those stories, to tell them with the imprimatur of the federal government, to have a place on the mall itself and not, way off where it would feel like entering through the back door. if you think about those comic books he did, the graphic memoirs of his own experiences, again, what was it about? It was about reaching the next generation with these stories. 13-year-old kids who maybe weren't going to pick up 3 volumes of Taylor Branch, in their school library, but could read March, even maybe read the 3 volumes of March. You know, just little things from his seat on the committee overseeing the national parks. He gets the Selma to Montgomery Trail named a national park, Route 80. Who had ever thought to name a highway a national park before? But for John Lewis, this was a way, again, of memorializing those historic accomplishments. So now, I don't know how many, but I'm sure many people, go down that trail and they're forced to reckon with that history in ways that they wouldn't otherwise. So I think in all these ways, he really becomes sort of a public historian, sort of using the leverage and the standing that he has as a congressman and public figure to sort of promote and amplify this very important history in which he played a central part. I've talked about protest and politics. I want to touch on one sort of third P, which is a part of his life, which is the personal. When I had first set out to write this book, I had never done a full-scale biography, and it seemed rather daunting, and I thought, I'm going to really mainly focus on the public man, just sort of John Lewis in the news, what we know of him. And I mentioned that when I started the book, there was no biography of him. Well, since then, there have been a couple other biographies that beat me to the punch. In fact, I remember saying to one friend of mine, when I was starting the book, there's 2 people who could start this book after me and finish before me. John Meacham and Doug Brinkley. And the friend said, I'm having lunch with Meacham. I'll suss him out. He said, good news. He's doing Dolly Madison. You're in the clear. But anyway, John wrote a splendid little book just the year that Mr. Lewis died, covering just his years in the movement. So it was out first, but he graciously blurbed my book anyway, saying this is the bigger definitive book. But the other 2 books on Lewis really did focus on the public man, and I began seeing you can't tell the story of John Lewis in full without talking about the rest of him, including especially his wife Lillian, who really was never in the news, very press shy, few interviews with her. But one friend of John Lewis's, a white congressman from the adjacent district named Buddy Darden, who remained close friends with John and Lillian, said, you can't tell John Lewis's story without telling the story of Lillian. In 1968, after that very depressing time of the assassinations of King and Kennedy, John Lewis was so burned out, he checks into the hospital under his doctor's recommendation for what they called exhaustion, but was really depression. And he had just started dating Lillian. He'd never really dated anyone seriously in his life. And Lillian comes each day, she brings him his mail, she brings him his newspaper, and quite unromantically, from the hospital bed, he proposes to her. And really, for the next, several decades until the time of her death, she's the one who puts kind of the steel in his spine. I mean, that doesn't sound right because he was such a resolute, determined figure. But I would say maybe better put, gives him the confidence to be the one you can run for Congress. You don't have to step aside for Julian Bond. You can do this. She wanted him to run for Speaker of the House. Her belief in him was limitless. And she could also be sort of the bad cop when, he, was supposed to fire someone and wouldn't do it. That would all fall to Lillian. And I just came to see how important she was to his career and, of course, to his life. But by the personal side, I also came through talking to friends, colleagues, just about other sides of him. I mean, I had no idea, for example, he has this phenomenal collection of African-American art. it was Lillian who sort of introduced him to art, although at Fisk he had taken an art history class with Aaron Douglas, who by that point was teaching at Fisk, so he had some introduction to it then. They become collectors. He becomes friendly with Jacob Lawrence, Romare Bearden. He becomes a collector of folk art. Staff would tell stories about driving with him back from somewhere in Alabama to the Atlanta office, and they'd go off on some back roads and meet with a folk artist who's taking out canvases from under the bed. And some of these people went on to gain recognition, and some of this art turned out to be worth something later on in years. The way that John Lewis loved to talk to children, like in Congress, he often, was famous for kind of going missing. They would need him back in the office where like Georgia Gas and Electric executives were waiting for him. And one of them said, what we would do is we would listen for the voices of school children echoing off the marble in the corridors, because sure enough, he would be there with the students, again, telling them stories about the movement, telling them his stories. He would like to take friends' children up to the steps all the way up to the rotunda and sort of show them, the hidden treasures, or take them to the congressional mess for the lunch, for lunch. And this sense, again, of sort of tending to the kids. And it was also just tending to every individual. Another story, once one of his chief of staff told me they're late for a meeting at the Speaker of the House's office. And they're exiting the Cannon building where John Lewis had his office. And the security guard there stops Mr. Lewis. He knows him. There's something about his son they want to discuss. And John Lewis stops to talk to this man about what's going on with his son. Chief of staff is kind of tugging at his sleeve. We're late. And John says, now, Rob, the speaker can wait. I'm listening to this man. And he did that with everyone. If it was a book signing, he would be there for 2 hours till the last book was signed. One friend's daughter talked about seeing him, at the Lenox Mall in Atlanta at Panda Express on Black Friday after Thanksgiving, that he was just there like a regular person. And, again, I think this kind of gets back to just the humanity he saw in everyone. And it was really tied to his political philosophy. I mean, the personal and the political don't always align in everybody's stories. And in some ways, maybe they don't fully in John Lewis's. But in this respect, I think they did. That, no matter who you were, whatever your race, your religion, gender, what have you, but also your station in life. People told stories about the maintenance guy would come to replace the light bulb in his congressional office, and like John Lewis would be there holding the ladder. It's like, you're the congressman, you don't need to do that, but he would do that. And I think that common sense humanity he saw in everyone. And I'll just tell one last story here, and then I do want to move to questions, but I think a last story that maybe speaks to the moment a little bit. People often ask, the other question I often get asked first is, well, what would John Lewis say about what's happening today? And I really don't like to, what I've called ventriloquize the dead. And even being John Lewis's biographer, as much as I feel I have gotten to know him and the way he would think and feel, I don't feel like I can speak on his behalf. That's not my role. But we do know how John Lewis, what he said and what he did the first time Trump was elected. And, I imagine it would be quite similar. And there's one story, but there were actually many stories like this, and I had to resist the urge not to put them all in. So there's one or two in the book. After the 2016 election, which in some ways, I don't know about your experience, was as stunning and shocking as this most recent one with Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton, people were in a state of shock. I mean, much the way many of us are now. And one woman describes walking through the Atlanta airport, feeling down, feeling despondent. And of course, the Atlanta airport is a place where John Lewis spent a lot of time. And she sees John Lewis there getting a shoe shine. And she walks over to him. And he steps down from the pedestal. And they talk. And he gives her a hug. And a lot of people have these stories like this. John Lewis loved to hug. But people felt the need to hug him. It was almost like a holy or religious quality, like touching the hem of his garment. There was just something about it that gave people sustenance. And this woman walks away, and she later tells a reporter, after that, I knew I was going to be okay. And, I'm not saying that, any one person can just reassure us or make everything okay. But I do think that John Lewis, both through his temperament, through this kind of inveterate, incorrigible hopefulness, I often say it wasn't optimism. Optimism is a disposition. Hope is a choice. And he chose hope. He resolved to be hopeful. I think those are things we can turn to today for, solace and sustenance and inspiration. And look, John Lewis was born into a world and lived his early years in a world that I think many would agree was worse than, what we're going through now. Certainly, I think worse if you were born into poverty as a black boy in Jim Crow, Alabama at that time. And yet he found the resolve and the determination and the hope to work together with others, to find a community through which they could, in the words of the song that he loved to sing, overcome. And I do think or hope that, his life, his example can give us at least a little bit of that hope and determination to forge ahead and overcome again. So let me end my remarks there and turn to you for comments, questions, thoughts of yours. Thank you. And here, we have Mike. You want to help with Mike? Thanks. All right. You do that. So in the room. Thanks. Okay. All right. Yeah, I saw one hand on the side. Right.
Where would you place the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? Would you say that his legacy has not been totally fulfilled until Congress approves the John Lewis Voting Rights Act?
Yeah. Well, I clearly, in 2013, and I have a section in the book on this, people may remember, the Voting Rights Act was deeply undermined by the Shelby County Supreme Court ruling. And it's interesting, 9 years earlier, John Lewis had crossed the congressional rotunda to go to the Senate to testify against the appointment of John Roberts as Chief Justice. And his reason, John Lewis, like others, some of this was kind of getting public circulation, had been through John Roberts' papers from his time in the Reagan Justice Department. And he said this man is going to gut the Voting Rights Act. Roberts had left plenty of crystal clear clues as to what he thought, that was an act whose had served its purpose and America was in a different place. We didn't need it anymore. That was John Roberts' view. So, these days, John Roberts is like the liberals' hope to maybe eke out a Supreme Court majority. But on Shelby County, he was not hope for anything. And yes, I think until some of those protections, the key was that states, like Georgia, like others in the South, could not just willy-nilly change their voting requirements if they had a history of past racial voting discrimination. They would have to get, clearance from the Justice Department in order to do so. And I think, now, we've been talking today and recent weeks about what's happening at the federal level, but for the last 10 years in many states, there's been a real scaling back of voter protections and imposition of new restrictions on voting. And that's what the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is designed to undo, to get us at least back to a place before Shelby County. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done on voting rights. Obviously the coming years aren't looking good for it, but one can hope for the future beyond. No?
Thanks so much. I enjoyed your book, and one of the things I found in your book, but I haven't heard so much about in your comments, is the importance of his religion.
Yeah. Oh, very important. I didn't talk about it that much today. I could. Really grew up with his Christianity, really his mother's faith, but the whole family's, as a core part of what the family was all about. He wanted to be a preacher as a boy. Many of you, I don't usually tell the story because he told it so much, that as a boy he used to preach to his chickens on the farm. I always say they were his flock. And he goes to Bible college. It's not a coincidence that he winds up at American Baptist Theological Seminary. His mother, who besides working the farm, also kind of moonlights as a domestic laborer, brings home a pamphlet or brochure from, I've seen it described as an orphanage, somewhere where she worked. They hadn't heard of this place, but this is the place that welcomes him to college. And there, it's the group in Nashville that he falls in with. Reverend Kelly Miller Smith, who's one of his teachers at American Baptist, who also leads First Baptist Church in Nashville, who's head of the local NAACP. James Lawson, the divinity student at Vanderbilt, someone of Martin Luther King's age, who King says, knows nonviolence teaching even better than he, meaning King himself. This is the environment in which their commitment to integration, to racial equality is forged. And later, when SNCC is formed, and SNCC comes to encompass a lot of these different student movements, and in particular the group from Howard University, is less religiously oriented, and splits emerge within SNCC. And by the time of 1966, when John Lewis is really deposed as chairman, that's another big story I won't tell now, but is in the book. A lot of the complaints are he's too churchy. He's too still committed to this religious stuff that's kind of falling out of favor. But he does remain devout. Now, later in life, one of his chiefs of staff told me, by his congressional career, Sunday morning was not about church. It was about the shows, Meet the Press, Face the Nation, all of those. So, later in life, he's somewhat less of a churchgoer, although he certainly does go somewhat regularly. But it's still a part of him. And one thing I was struck by, I couldn't find examples of him. He was an ordained minister from the time he was like 16. Couldn't find examples of him playing that role except officiating at weddings of friends and staffers. But after 9/11, it's funny, people don't remember this, but you can see the YouTube video of it. The day after, all of Congress gathers in the rotunda to hear John Lewis lead them in prayer. And it's not political at all. It's about, oh God, who holds us in your hands, and it's looking for guidance, looking for safety and protection, and it's an incredibly moving religious message. So it clearly stays a part of him, and is a kind of guiding principle and set of ideas, even into a part of his life where he is kind of less publicly religious. Your time? Your time for one more? Okay.
Hey, thanks so much for your remarks today. This is more on the journalism research side. You talked a little bit about some folks you're able to essentially wear down, like the his staff, John Luce's chief of staff or his staff, and Archie, I guess, the guy with the archive. So, what is your strategy when you're trying to get these people who say no to eventually say yes? How do you actually go about convincing them to say yes?
That's it. It's a good question. And, look, there were a few people who I never got to. I mean, most disappointingly, his son, John Miles, um, just didn't want to talk. At one point, we set up a phone interview. He ghosted me, tried again, texted, whatever. He didn't want to do it. And I surmised John Lewis, I think, had some struggles, and I think it probably wasn't in some ways easy being John Lewis's son, his being hailed as a saint and kind of living in that shadow. But I don't know, because I didn't get to him. But for those I did, I think one, I had to convince them that I was sincere, that I didn't have some ulterior motive or agenda. But I think also, persistence can be annoying, but it can also be a sign like, okay, this person's serious about it. And sometimes, trying again and again, you're able to convey, look, I'm not just another reporter doing a quick story. I mean, they're entitled to their stories too. But, that I'm in this for the long haul, that I need their help, that their help is going to be valuable to me. And I think deep down, people want to talk. I think deep down, people want to tell their stories or how they saw an event or a person. And so if they start to appreciate, okay, this book's coming out and this story's going to be told, maybe I should get my 2 cents in there. I think that kind of thinking starts to kick in too. But it's a crapshoot. There are a lot of people do come around, but there's always some who don't. Okay, thanks everyone.
David Greenberg's book, John Lewis, A Life, is there. And David, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll be back in 15 minutes, which is 2:20. Be back. We'll see you then. Thank you.
Do you have the other microphone?
I do, over here.